Hey everybody, welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games. Today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today we're going to be talking about my top 10 LCGs or living card games. Now the living card game is a type of game, but it's more like a type of distribution of the game. The living card game is a response to the collectible card game from the early 1990s with Magic the Gathering and all of its other spiritual successors. The living card game, instead of consumers purchasing a random booster pack and opening it up to find what's inside, maybe a common, maybe some rares, maybe a bunch of cards that you already had. It's a surprise, it's open-ended. Instead, with the living card model, you know exactly what cards you're getting to add to your collection. Now, Fantasy Flight in particular is the publisher that's associated with these games. So all 10 of these games on this list are published by Fantasy Flight Games. So, without any further ado, let's get straight to my list. My number 10 living card game is Arkham Horror, the living card game. And this is going to delegitimize this list for so many people. Tons of you are going to turn away and never watch this channel ever again. Yes, Arkham Horror, the living card game, which I believe is the highest ranked of these 10 games on BoardGameGeek.com. It has the biggest following, if you will, because it's just released tons of content and it's an exciting narrative-driven game. Why is it number 10 for me? It just does not connect with me as much as the other 9. I have to say a few things. For starters, I've only played the base game and one additional scenario from one of the cycles. Now, what will people tell me? Well, you got to play a full cycle. If you play a full cycle, you'll change your mind. Here's the thing, guys. For the other 9 games on this list, most of them I have not played any expansions for. So I cannot use that excuse for Arkham Horror, the living card game, and disregard it for the other 9. Also, for me, if I'm going to go into the H.P. Lovecraft Cthulhu Mythos universe, my preferred way of going about it is either Eldritch Horror or Arkham Horror 2nd Edition. That's the way I'm going to go to get that type of experience. Furthermore, I do not play these type of games, the living card games, I do not play them to get this narrative campaign experience. I do not play campaign mode, even for the few games on this list that offer a campaign mode. That is not what I go about. I want to build some decks, I want to play a game, I want to react to the situations that the game presents, and so on and so forth. And not to say that Arkham Horror does not grant you those opportunities, but of the 10 games on this list, it's the one that I'm interested in least, mechanically speaking. My number 10 living card game, Arkham Horror, the living card game. Now that we've gotten through that, we've gotten past that, if you're still here with me, let's move on to my number 9 living card game, and that is Warhammer Conquest. Warhammer 40K Conquest. And this is based on the Warhammer 40K universe, and it's a fantastical, futuristic universe. And basically in this game, players could choose one of the factions, and I believe the base game comes with 7 factions. I believe expansions add an 8th and 9th faction that players can choose from to build their decks. The cool thing about this game is players are vying for control over 7 different areas, represented by these different cards that you lay out across the table. And you're sending your commander. Every player has a special character. Along with their regular units that make up their deck, they have their commander card. And their commander card is a very powerful unit, more powerful than anything they can find in their deck. And the commander has higher health thresholds and what have you, higher attack values. Here's the thing. You have the secret dial that at the beginning of each round, players are going to secretly choose which of the 7 locations they're going to go to. So part of it is trying to decipher where you think your opponent's going to go. Sometimes you're going to want to go to an unoccupied place that you think you have a better chance of taking over because you're not going to have any contention there. Or if you're trying to prevent your opponent from taking over a place, you might want to anticipate where they're going to go. So that little game of guessing and figuring out your opponent's strategy, that's a really cool factor. Also, your commander has 2 sides. Once he has sustained full damage, he's not eliminated. You flip him over to his bloodied side. Now, if his bloodied side is ever damaged to its fullest health, then yes, you have lost the game. So that's a secondary way of losing the game. But the primary way of winning the game or losing the game is to be the first player to control 3 different locations with the same icon. So each of these locations have 1 or 2 different color-coded icons printed on them. I believe it's blue, green, or red, something like that. And once you've collected 3 or you've conquered 3 of these locations with the same color icon, you have won the game. So there's 2 different ways of winning the game. I really think that's cool. I like the secret dial. Haven't played it as much as I've played some of the other games on this list. But for now, it's my number 9 living card game, Warhammer Conquest. Now we move on to my number 8 living card game, and that's the Call of Cthulhu, the living card game. So yes, this is my Cthulhu living card game of choice. It's a competitive card game designed by Eric Lang, no longer in print, which I believe is the case for all of the competitive LCGs in Fantasy Flight and on this list. So this game here, what I like about the game is very similar to Warhammer Conquest, which also has Eric Lang as its main designer. You have these different locations. There are always 3 available at a time, and as a player wins one over, you replace them. Now players are going to be going to these different locations, and they're trying to get their search tokens. They're trying to investigate these locations to the fullest and get their search tokens to a certain threshold on each of these locations before their opponent can. Now, the cool thing about this game is the resource generating. I love how these different games have different ways of generating resources that you're going to use to pay for the cards in your hand. In this game, you start with 3 different domains represented by these Cthulhu miniature pieces. And each of these domains are going to start with 1, 2 cards down there. And these are the same cards that you're using from your hand. And at the beginning of each round, you're going to choose a card from your hand and you're going to put it in one of the domains, and each of the cards has an icon. It either has a basic faction icon or it has an icon of one of the factions. And there are 8 factions in this game. You can build your deck monolithic with just 1 faction, or you can build 2 factions in your deck. And if you do, you got to factor that in, because as you're putting these cards into your domains, for the faction it represents, whether it's one of the actual 8 factions or it's just the neutral faction, that's going to generate a resource icon. And to pay for a card of, let's say, the Cthulhu faction, you're going to need to spend resources from a domain that has at least 1 Cthulhu faction icon on it. And as each of these cards represents 1 resource, so as your domains get bigger, as you're placing these cards round by round into your separate domains, you're going to be able to pay for more cards. Now, here's the thing. You only have 3 domains. So technically speaking, at most, you'll be able to pay for 3 cards per round. There are ways of getting additional domains throughout the course of the game, which will increase your chances for purchasing more cards. But for the most part, you're going to be building 3 cards of varying expenses or varying costs depending on how you build your domains. You might just want to focus on 1 domain and build it up a lot, or some of your other domains you can build equally, so you can afford multiple cards of a decent worth throughout the course of the game, and eventually rev up to the point where you can afford some really, really expensive cards. That's a really cool part of the game for me, just managing that resource aspect. Really cool. My number 8 living card game, Call of Cthulhu, the living card game. Now my number 7 living card game, and that is Android Netrunner. And Android Netrunner is not only the most asymmetric out of all the games on this top 10 list, but it's probably the most asymmetric game I own in my entire board game collection. In this game, this is a 2-player only game where 1 player is going to be taking on the role of the runner, and the other player is going to be taking on the role of the corporation, the evil corporation from this dystopian future. And there are 4 different corporations to pick from and 3 different runners to pick from, or it might be the other way around. There might be 4 different runners and 3 different corporations. And each of these corporations and runners play differently, but the goal that 1 player has is different according to which side they're on. The runner is trying to build up their engine in order to hack the different servers of the corporation and steal their data and find their agendas, which are going to score points. And if they're able to do this, then they will win the game. Now, the other player is going to run the corporation, and the corporation has multiple servers, and in these servers, they're going to be hiding their secret agendas. They're also going to be bluffing and making, or hopefully making, the other player think that their agendas are somewhere where they are not, in order to make them waste their time. And if they can keep these agendas hidden for long enough and advance them little by little, that's one of the actions they'll be taking, and advance them, then they will win the game if they can do that before the net player or the Netrunner finds a certain amount of those agendas. It is so cool because even the terminology used for your deck, for your discard pile, for your trash pile, all of these are different based on which side of the game you're on. The amount of actions you take on your turn is different. I believe the runner has 3 actions while the corporation has 4 actions. Also, the types of actions that you can take throughout the course of your turn, for the most part, are different. There are some overlap. There are a few actions that are similar from one player to another, but there's a bunch of actions that only one side of the table can do. I find that to be really, really cool. My number 7 living card game, Android Netrunner. Now we move on to my number 6 living card game, and that is Star Wars, the card game. And this is another Eric Lang LCG from Fantasy Flight, another competitive LCG. As I said, most of these are actually competitive LCGs. And this game here has a Star Wars theme, the Star Wars intellectual property. I'm a big fan of the Star Wars universe. I like that aspect of it. You have all these different factions, and you're going to pick one of these factions and you're going to play against your opponent. I believe there is a way with one of the expansions to play 2 versus 1. I have not played that yet. But the cool thing about this game is these tokens that you place on your units as you utilize them, as you use them, as you trigger them. You place these exhaust tokens to represent that they have been used. And the cool thing about this game is, throughout the course of this game, every turn, you're allowed to remove 1 exhaust token per unit or per card. But some of these cards have the ability to exhaust multiple times before you're unable to use them. Here's the thing, because they can exhaust multiple times, it's also going to take longer to use them again, because you're only granted 1 removal of an exhaust token per round. So you're going to have to wait 2 rounds to trigger that particular card or to use that card. You also want to factor in which cards you exhaust, because if you exhaust them, you won't be able to defend against your opponent when it's their turn. So there's all these things to consider. And there are some additional ways of removing exhaust tokens, which you have to try to manipulate according to your advantage, because you want to have as many units ready and available. You also have this really cool like tug of war that triggers every so often. It's kind of like, I forgot the word, it's a fate battle. And basically players are using some of the cards from their hand, cards that they might want to use as units, cards that they might want to use for different actions. You're going to use those cards to try to beat your opponent in this little fate struggle, because that's a very important aspect to the game, and it rewards you accordingly. Also, there's another tug of war, which is the push and pull between where is the force, who has the force. Is the force on the side of the dark side, or is the force on the side of the good side? And each player asymmetrically is going to have a benefit at the beginning of their round, the beginning of their turn, if at the beginning of their turn they control the force. Just a really cool game. Players are trying to destroy the different bases of their opponent, and players are always going to have 3 different bases visible, and they each have different amount of victory points accordingly, and they each have different abilities. Sometimes you might want to go to a particular base because of its victory points. Sometimes you might want to go to a particular base because of its annoying ability that it's granting your opponent. Really cool game with a popular IP. My number 6 living card game, Star Wars, the card game. Now we move on to my number 5 living card game, and that is Warhammer Invasion. And just like I mentioned earlier, Warhammer Conquest, which is based on the Warhammer 40K universe, Warhammer Invasion is based on the Old World universe from Warhammer as well. And this game here, the base game only comes with 4 different factions. I believe an expansion introduces another 2 factions. So I guess there's 6 factions in total that you can play with. You can be orcs, you can be elves, you can be dark elves. Now here's the really cool thing about this game. Every player has their own board representing their empire or their kingdom or their city, if you will. And this board has 3 sides that are relevant to placement. You are placing units on each of these 3 different sides. And each of these sides correspond with a different benefit. Some of these sides are going to make you stronger at attacking. Some of these sides are going to make you generate more resources. Some of these sides are going to make you draw more cards. So drawing more cards is going to be useful because you'll have more options. And as you place units down, you are factoring in many things. You're factoring in, first of all, which side might be vulnerable. You do not want to leave these sides too vulnerable, because the way you lose the game is if 2 out of those 3 sides are ever destroyed. Each of these sides actually have their own hit points. If 2 of these 3 sides are destroyed, you're eliminated. And this is a multiplayer game. You could play 1 versus 1, but you could play all the way up to 4 players. So if 2 of those 3 sides are destroyed, you're eliminated. Those additional units around it serve as buffers to those sides' individual health. So you might want to put units just to protect them. But also, as you're placing your units, you're going to factor in that for each of these units and these particular symbols that these units have printed on them, you're going to be able to deal additional damage, or you're going to be able to draw additional cards on your turn, or you're going to be able to produce additional resource to purchase those cards on your turn. So all these things you're trying to factor in. You want to have a decent balance of all these things, or perhaps you might want to go all in on 1 or 2 of these aspects of your strategy. I just find that to be really neat as you're mapping out your game, as you're making your decisions, as you're reacting to the situation at hand. Really cool. My number 5 living card game, Warhammer Invasion. Now we move on to my number 4 living card game, and that is Lord of the Rings, the living card game. So this is another cooperative game. As you can see, it is ranked much higher than the last cooperative one on this list, which was Arkham Horror. And for me personally, I prefer the intellectual property. Also, unlike Arkham Horror, where I mentioned there are other alternatives that I prefer over it for that same universe, for Lord of the Rings, this is probably my go-to game for this theme. I just really like it. And again, I have not played much content for this outside of the base game. I think I've played about 5 other scenarios from one of the cycles outside of it. But I've really, really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the variety from scenario to scenario. Each of the scenarios feel very different. Some of these scenarios are very, very difficult. As a matter of fact, I personally find even the easier ones to be very, very nail-biting. It's a challenging game. I still haven't quite figured out how to be super successful at it, but I really enjoy just exploring the different characters. Most of them are very popular characters you're familiar with from the movies. Some of them are a little bit more obscure, but getting these characters, choosing a team of 3 heroes to go at it, building your deck according to the different spheres of influence that are in the game. Sometimes you might want to pick 3 heroes from one particular sphere, probably not to your advantage. If you're playing solo, you might want to include 2 spheres of influence in your deck. That way you can diversify your strategy. But it's just a really cool game. I like the Middle-earth universe. I like the way the game plays. My number 4 living card game of all time, Lord of the Rings, the living card game. Now we move on to my number 3 living card game, and this is the most recent one to the list. It's the only one that I had not played the last time I made this top 10 list, and that's the Legend of the 5 Rings. And this game here, it's the only game on this list that was not designed by either Eric Lang or Nate French, and it's by far the most different game because of that. It has a fantastical Japanese feudal medieval theme to it. It has a lot of different factions with lots of diversity as far as how the different factions play. But the cool thing about this game is you're building 2 decks. You have your Dynasty deck and you have your Conflict deck. And there's different phases throughout the course of a round in which you're using one or the other deck. I find it to be cool. You're not only just building 1 deck, you're building 2. And both of these decks include different types of events, different types of units that you're going to be placing. And the game has 2 different ways of winning. First of all, you can win the game by defeating your opponent's province. Your opponent has their stronghold. That's their main province. They also have 4 additional provinces. Before you can even attack their stronghold, you must break. That is, you must defeat and overtake 3 of their 4 other strongholds. Once you have done that, you are eligible to attack their main stronghold. And if you're able to successfully break it, then you win the game. Of course, your opponent is using units and playing units to try to counter your units and prevent you from defeating that stronghold or even those other provinces for that matter. Now, there's a secondary way of winning the game. There is a currency in this game referred to as honor, and the players begin with a certain amount of honor according to their particular factions. The factions are very asymmetric even in that sense. And throughout the course of the game, you're going to be taking actions that help you accrue additional honor. You're also going to be taking actions that make you lose honor or even give them to your opponent, which is you have these secret dials and players are simultaneously choosing how many cards they want to draw. And they're going to reveal those. And the discrepancy between the highest and lowest. So if one player chose to draw 5 cards and the other player chose to draw 2 cards, that would be a difference of 3. Now the player who chose the lower amount is going to be able to gain 3 honor or take 3 honor from the player who chose 5. So that's something to consider. Is drawing all of those additional cards worth not only you losing honor, but giving honor to your opponent? And once a player reaches 25 honor tokens, or a player is reduced to 0 honor tokens, the game ends. So you can lose by having your honor reduced to 0, or you can win by having your honor increased to 25. So I like the fact that there's an additional way of winning the game. Just really cool. I like the beautiful artwork. I like the fact that it feels so different from the other 9 games on this list. Also, it's by far the game I've played the fewest times, so I'm wondering if it even has potential of climbing even higher. We'll see. My number 3 living card game, Legend of the 5 Rings. Now we move on to my number 2 living card game, and I like this game a lot. And definitely for this list, the intellectual properties absolutely affected where some of these games ranked. And my number 2 is A Game of Thrones, the living card game. And this is my highest ranked competitive living card game. This is from the Westeros, Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones universe. And I love the fact that this game could play actually all the way up to 6 players. I have not done that yet. The most I've played is 4. But I love the fact that that's even an option. And it seems like a very viable option because the way it accommodates for these additional players is there's this game of role selection at the beginning of each round. And these roles are going to grant you particular advantages, benefits, powers, but they're also going to limit who you can attack throughout the course of the round. So you cannot just pick on someone because they rubbed you the wrong way. No, you've got to actually follow the particular rules according to your role selection. So even that role selection aspect, you want to anticipate what your opponents, if you know that someone has it out against you, you probably want to anticipate what role they're going to pick your role accordingly. That way, hopefully, you've chosen correctly and that player won't be able to mess with you for the rest of that round. Just really, really cool, but I do prefer it at 2 players, 1v1, tactical, strategic response. There are 3 different combat types in this game. That's one of the things I like about it. You have your regular military combat, you have your political or power, it's called, combat, and you have your intrigue combat. And all of your characters have stats in 1 or even 2 of those different combat types. And as you're choosing your attacks, you're choosing who you want to attack, and you're exhausting your cards, typical rotating 90 degrees, and then you're resolving these attacks. And the different types of combats have different rewards. So sometimes you're going to choose what combats you want to trigger, even based on the reward that you're trying to accrue. Also, you want to think which combats you're most likely to win. This game penalizes you for allowing your opponent to win a contest uncontested. So that's something you want to consider as you have your units and you're choosing who to defend or who can even defend. The game ends when one player scores 15 power. That is a currency in the game. It's a token that you accrue throughout different courses of actions. Every time you win a power struggle, there are other different actions that allow you to accrue additional power. And once a player gets to 15 power tokens, it's the end of the game and they are the winner. They sit on the Iron Throne. Really cool game with a Game of Thrones theme. My number 2 living card game, A Game of Thrones, the living card game. And now we move on to my number 1. And at this point, it should be no surprise since there are only 10 LCGs in Fantasy Flight. And I already mentioned that Game of Thrones, the living card game, was my highest competitive game. This is my highest cooperative game, and that's Marvel Champions. And I'm a big Marvel fan, as you can tell from my backdrop here. And Marvel Champions is just an excellent game. I really like it. I love the Marvel superheroes. I love the idea of controlling a hero. And that's exactly what it feels like. No game I play from a Marvel theme really makes me feel so much like that character. as I feel when I play Marvel Champions. Every player has their identity card, which represents the hero that they've picked for that game. They also have a toolkit of 15 signature cards that they're going to use as a starting point for their deck. They're going to add an additional 25 plus cards to that deck to have a deck of 40 or more, and they're going to go on their different battles and their different scenarios, fighting the different villains across the Marvel Universe. But again, those 15 signature cards, along with your identity card, really make you feel like that character. It really makes you feel like the strengths of that character are your strengths, like the weaknesses of that character are your weaknesses. Also, I love the tension of the identity card flipping over from alter ego to hero side. It's the only game I've seen like that. So you have to manage the balance, and very often you're going to be incentivized to go to your alter ego side because you're going to need to recover from all the damage that the villain has inflicted upon you. But at the same time, you don't want to stay in alter ego too long, because while you're in alter ego, there's nobody there to stop the villain, and they will advance their schemes and win the game. It's just such a neat experience. I love the resource management in that game, because you have the tension that your very cards in your hand are the money for your cards. And I believe out of the 10 games on this list, this might be the only game. Yeah, I believe this is the only game in this system here, in these 10 games, where your money is your very same cards. So you have a hand of 6 cards, let's say, and you have 3 really good cards. Chances are you're not going to be able to play all those 3 cards, because you're going to have to use some of those cards to pay for the others. And making the right decision as to which card you pick, reacting to your situation at hand, the current circumstances, is such a crucial situation. You're going to run through your deck much more often than some of these other games because of the fact that you're using your very same cards to spend for the other cards. So I find myself cycling through my deck 1, 2, maybe sometimes even 3 times a game, as opposed to some of these other games where I might not cycle through the deck at all. As a matter of fact, for some of these games, running through your deck is another end of game condition. So that's something to factor in. So I just really like, some people might not like that restriction of having all these cards for not being able to play all of them, but I really do like to be challenged in that way. And because of that, and many other reasons, Marvel Champions is my #1 living card game of all time. And that's it for today's list, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here at When Harry Met Board Games. Please comment down below. Tell me what you think about these 10 games. Which is your favorite LCG game? Which one are you surprised I have too low? I have an idea of what you might be thinking. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.